Well, for the opposition's take on the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, I'm joined in Sydney by the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. Chris Bowen, during the election campaign, Labor planned to run bigger deficits over the forward estimates. Surely you can't have a problem then with Scott Morrison doing just that?
Well, during the election campaign, Lee, I pointed out that Scott Morrison's forecasts were overly optimistic and, in fact, in some cases heroic, and that's been borne out today. He said that that was wrong. In fact, it was right. In terms of the deficits, of course, we had a more realistic a reporting of the budget deficits because we didn't include measures which were never going to pass the Parliament, which are still in the budget today, the zombie measures which Scott Morrison clings onto, Joe Hockey's cuts which he clings onto, which haven't received the support of the Australian people or the Parliament. And then, of course, importantly and briefly, Lee, we then saw our budget surpluses grow very strongly because our reforms like negative gearing and capital gains tax reform did take a little bit of time to hit the budget in a positive sense, but then grow very quickly.
My point is that they are also looking at larger deficits and they have a suite of policies that they claim will also return the budget to surplus, which is what you were doing just by other means.
Well, we have a different way of doing it. In fact, it was open to the government today, for example, the 2021 budget, the surplus, which they've projected, is wafer thin at $1 billion. It would blow over in a breeze. It's subject to parameter variations. They could have boosted it by about $4 billion if they dropped their company tax cuts, their big business tax cuts, and adopted sensible reforms to negative gearing and capital gains tax.
In your own book, you said it's a Labor thing to have the ambition of reducing company tax because it promotes investment, creates jobs and drives growth.
And I've consistently said in a perfect world, when the budget could afford it, of course lower tax is better than higher tax.
You don't accept that the economy needs stimulating at the moment that could be helped along by a company tax cut?
Well, budgets are about priorities, Lee, and our priority would be to protect the AAA rating. And you can't say, on the one hand, we've just taken a $30 billion hit to revenue. Aha, I know the answer. Let's reduce revenue by a further $50 billion over the decade, which is what the Treasurer just argued to you. Now, you can't do both. What you've got to do is prioritise in a budget, and the budget simply can't afford a $50 billion hit, which Scott Morrison wants to give. I mean,
you just raised, Shadow Treasurer, the credit rating. Standard & Poor's has said this afternoon that it's keeping Australia on a AAA credit rating for now. Surely that's something of an endorsement of the Treasurer's approach today.
Well, it's very welcome, the three ratings agencies doing that. But when you look at what Standard & Poor's has said, for example, they've not said we doubt the government's ability to get their existing policies through the Parliament. What they've said is we are looking for new measures, including new revenue measures. Standard & Poor's has made it very clear that they're looking for a fresh approach from the government, in my view. And revenue measures are another way of saying things like negative gearing reform, capital gains tax reform. That's what we've been promoting and leading the debate on. And, of course, that's open to the government. They could lock in the AAA rating. Make no mistake, Lee, it's welcome that they've not downgraded the rating today. But make no mistake, the rating is still very much in the danger zone as a result of the actions of this government.
But even if Australia were downgraded to AA+, that's the same rating as the United States. New Zealand's a AA. What's the big deal? The sky won't fall in.
Well, it's not good, Lee, and I think what we should be very aware of is, one, the increase in government borrowing costs, Commonwealth borrowing cost. It would flow through to state borrowing costs because the states' ratings would be downgraded almost inevitably. And then, of course, the banks' ratings would be downgraded, increasing their borrowing costs, which they, of course, would pass on to mortgage holders and business people. And, of course, then there's the blow to business and consumer confidence. So I don't think you can just be blasé about it and say, oh, AA's all right, because we managed to get 3 AAA ratings during the depths of the global financial crisis. We're a member of a very small club that have the 3 AAA ratings, and the fact that the government just seems resigned to losing the AAA rating, I think, is deeply concerning.
But realistically, you pointed out some of the problems with having a downgrade, but a downgrade in the credit rating would also cause the Australian dollar to fall. That would make it cheaper for overseas companies to buy our products, to do business here, to travel in Australia. That would all stimulate the economy.
Well, Lee, if you're arguing that a downgrade would be a good thing for the economy, I'm going to have to respectfully disagree. I think the AAA rating is important not only for our borrowing costs, but also the borrowing costs of our banks, because they get downgraded almost inevitably if the sovereign rating falls. It is a bad thing for the economy to lose the AAA. It should be a bipartisan objective to keep it. Hence us working with the government where we can. The Treasurer was boasting in his press conference that they've passed 2/3 of their savings targets. That's pretty right, and the vast majority of that with our support. What we won't do is sell out on our values and vote for things we've consistently opposed now for 3 years, things which cost Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott their jobs, and quite rightly.
You are saying you're working with them where you can. You said today that the government should be stimulating private sector investment. I put to you again, wouldn't company tax cuts do exactly that quite efficiently.
No, Lee, because on the government's own figuring, on their own modelling, their tax cuts, if delivered in full to all Australian businesses, would increase the size of our economy by 1% in 20 years' time. I mean, we just lost 0.5% in 1 quarter. They say their big plan, their big idea, boosts the economy by 1% in 2 decades' time. That's not an economic plan which stimulates activity now. It certainly doesn't have the answers to the challenges we're facing in the economy now. It's on a wing and a prayer that it somehow stimulates more business investment, at a massive cost to the budget.
But if you want Australia to be competitive, our corporate tax rate at the moment is 30%, New Zealand's is 28%, the US President-elect Donald Trump wants to cut theirs to 15%. Why wouldn't you look at... They're asking for 27.5. It's not that big a change. Why could you not come to the party on that?
Well, at a hit to the budget of $50 billion over the next decade. Now, they lecture the Australian people about the need for restraint. They say we can't afford more money for schools and investment in education, but they can afford a $50 billion tax cut. It simply can't be afforded. Now, of course, you have a view to the competitiveness of our tax rates. Of course you do, Lee. But you compare apples with apples at the same time. And we have dividend imputation in Australia. There are state corporate taxes in the United States, for example, which sit above the rate imposed by Washington. You've got to have all these things borne in mind. And of course, Lee, we just went through a massive investment boom under Labor's watch with a 30% corporate tax rate during the mining boom.
Can I ask, if you're so worried about the revenue implications of cutting a company tax rate, why then did you say, as I said before, in your own book, that it should be a Labor goal to always cut company tax because it promotes investment, creates jobs and drives growth?
Well, of course, Lee, what it does is those things if you pay for it. Now, when Labor cut the corporate tax rate, which Paul Keating did, he paid for it. He's made that very clear. He had measures in place to broaden the base, to remove different deductions in the corporate system. He introduced fringe benefits tax and capital gains tax against the screams of the then Liberal Party led by John Howard. So he actually had a plan to pay for it. I also wrote in that book about the importance of education funding. I wrote much more about the importance of education funding, for example. So if you're going to look at my book, let's look at it in context and in its totality. I argued for a lot of things in that book, and I argued for example, much better investment in education, but all in the context of what can be afforded at any particular time.
Chris Bowen, we're out of time. Unfortunately, like Scott Morrison, you are a very regular guest on this program. We thank you for that. Best wishes to you and your family for Christmas.
And the same to you and your family, Lee. Have a great Christmas.